The textile factory had been a marvel in its heyday. A sprawling building of red brick, belching smoke and spinning cotton into threads for the burgeoning industrial age. Now, it was nothing more than a skeleton of its former self, forgotten on the edge of a dying town. The windows were shattered, the walls streaked with rust and mildew, and the only sounds were the occasional cries of birds nesting in the rafters. It was perfect for urban explorers. Jessica, Marcus, and Tyler had planned the excursion for weeks. Equipped with flashlights, cameras, and a spirit of adventure, they parked their car at the edge of the factory grounds just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was crisp, the faint smell of decayed wood and metal mingling with the distant scent of pine trees. "All right," Marcus said, hefting his backpack over his shoulder. "Let's see if the stories are true." The stories. Everyone in town knew them, passed down from grandparents who had worked in the factory before it shut down under mysterious circumstances. Workers had begun to vanish, their tools left abandoned, looms still running. Some said it was an industrial accident that drove the factory's owner mad. Others whispered that it was something darker, something inhuman. Jessica rolled her eyes. "You don't seriously believe that, do you? It's probably just bad bookkeeping and a lot of OSHA violations." "Then explain the whispers," Tyler said, glancing nervously at the factory's shadowy silhouette. "My uncle swears he heard them when he broke in as a kid." "You're such a baby," Jessica teased, but her smile was tight. "Let's go." The factory loomed larger as they approached, its walls stretching into the darkness like a monolith. The main doors were chained shut, but Jessica had read about a side entrance through a broken window. They found it easily and clambered inside, the crunch of shattered glass underfoot announcing their arrival. Inside, the air was thick and cold. Their flashlights illuminated broken machinery, looms and spindles long rusted into silence. The floor was littered with scraps of fabric and tools, as though the workers had simply vanished mid-shift. "Check this out," Marcus said, shining his light on a wall. It was covered in faded posters of smiling factory workers and slogans like, "Efficiency is happiness." Jessica laughed nervously. "Creepy." As they ventured deeper, the whispers began. At first, it was so faint that they thought it was the wind, a low murmur brushing against the walls. But as they moved through the factory's labyrinthine corridors, the whispers grew louder. They weren't words, exactly, but a series of soft, rhythmic syllables, rising and falling like a chant. "Do you hear that?" Tyler whispered, his voice trembling. "Probably just the wind," Jessica said, though she couldn't hide the unease in her tone. Marcus frowned, his flashlight beam darting around the room. "It's coming from over there." They followed the sound, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. The whispers seemed to move, leading them through a maze of rusted machinery and crumbling walls. Jessica swore she saw shadows flicker at the edge of her vision, but every time she turned her head, there was nothing there. Finally, they reached the source, a large room filled with rows of old looms. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices blending into an unearthly hum. And then the looms began to move. One by one, the machines groaned to life, their spindles turning and belts creaking as though unseen hands were operating them. The three explorers froze, their breath caught in their throats. "Is this some kind of prank?" Jessica demanded, her voice cracking. Marcus shook his head, his eyes wide with terror. "No one else is here." The whispers coalesced into a single, chilling voice. "You shouldn't have come." The lights of their flashlights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Panic set in as they fumbled with their equipment, but the batteries were drained, the bulbs cold. And then they saw them, figures moving in the shadows, barely visible but undeniably there. They weren't human. Their forms were warped, their movements jerky, like marionettes on broken strings. The explorers backed away, but the figures advanced, their glowing eyes locked onto their prey. Jessica screamed as one of the figures lunged toward her, its skeletal hands outstretched. She swung her flashlight wildly, the metal connecting with the creature's head. It crumbled into ash, but more took its place, rising from the darkness like an unending tide. "We have to get out of here," Marcus shouted, grabbing Jessica's arm. They ran, Tyler close behind, but the factory seemed to shift around them. Hallways stretched longer than they should. Doors that had been open moments ago were now sealed shut. The whispers followed them, a mocking chorus that grew louder with every step. Finally, they found an exit, a gaping hole in the wall where the bricks had crumbled away. They scrambled through, their clothes tearing on the jagged edges, and stumbled into the night. The whispers stopped. They collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling with adrenaline. Tyler's flashlight flickered back to life, casting its feeble beam on the factory. It stood silent and still as though mocking them. "What the hell was that?" Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "We're never coming back here. Ever." But as they turned to leave, Tyler froze. His flashlight beam had caught something in the window. A face, pale and expressionless, staring down at them. It wasn't alone. Dozens of faces filled the windows, watching them, their mouths moving in silent whispers. And then, one by one, the faces vanished, leaving only the empty, broken glass. The factory had claimed its secrets once again. The train depot stood at the edge of the forest, cloaked in an eerie silence that seemed to shroud the entire area. Decades ago, it had been the lifeline of the nearby town, ferrying passengers and goods to distant places. Now it was a forgotten relic, swallowed by creeping vines and covered in moss. Local legend claimed the depot wasn't entirely abandoned, that on certain nights, a ghostly train arrived, carrying passengers who were long dead. Kara had always dismissed such tales as nonsense. As a photographer specializing in urban decay, she was used to chasing rumors to discover the perfect shot. The more haunted or unsettling the location, the better. When she heard about the depot and its supposed ghost train, she couldn't resist. It was late afternoon when she arrived, the sun casting long shadows across the empty tracks. The depot loomed before her, its peeling paint and boarded-up windows a testament to years of neglect. Kara parked her car on the dirt road nearby and grabbed her gear, her camera bag slung over one shoulder and a flashlight clipped to her belt. She stepped inside the depot through a hole in the wall, her boots crunching over broken glass and debris. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. The waiting room was just as she'd imagined. Rows of rotting benches, faded posters on the walls, and a ticket counter covered in layers of dust. She snapped photo after photo, framing the eerie desolation in her viewfinder. As the sun dipped lower, she ventured onto the platform. The tracks stretched endlessly into the forest, overgrown with weeds. Kara knelt to capture a shot of the tracks disappearing into the distance, but as she adjusted her focus, she froze. Far down the line, a faint light flickered. She lowered her camera, squinting into the gloom. The light grew brighter, accompanied by the distant sound of a train whistle. Kara's pulse quickened. There hadn't been a train on these tracks for decades. She knew that much from her research. The whistle sounded again, closer this time, and the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. She stumbled back, her camera hanging forgotten around her neck, as an old-fashioned steam train emerged from the darkness. The train came to a halt in front of her, its engine hissing and groaning. The windows were clouded, but Kara could see figures inside. Passengers sitting unnaturally still, their faces obscured. The doors slid open with a creak, and a cold wind rushed out, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Kara's instincts screamed at her to run, but her curiosity held her in place. She raised her camera, snapping a picture of the train and its ghostly passengers. As the flash illuminated the scene, she heard a voice behind her. "Boarding for the final destination." She whirled around. A man in a conductor's uniform stood on the platform, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were dark hollows, and his voice was flat, devoid of emotion. He extended a gloved hand toward her. "Your ticket, please." I don't have a ticket," Kara stammered, taking a step back. The conductor tilted his head, as if considering her response. "Everyone has a ticket," he said. "They just don't know it yet." The words sent a chill down her spine. She turned to flee, but the platform had changed. The forest was gone, replaced by a swirling mist that obscured everything beyond the tracks. The depot itself was no longer crumbling. It stood pristine, its windows glowing with an unearthly light. The passengers began to disembark, their movements slow and deliberate. Kara watched in horror as they stepped onto the platform. Their faces were pale and blank, their eyes unseeing. They moved like puppets, their heads jerking unnaturally with each step. "Come," the conductor said. "It's time." Kara shook her head, backing away. "No, I'm not supposed to be here." The conductor's expression darkened. "You came of your own free will. The train answers those who seek it." The passengers turned toward her, their empty eyes locking onto hers. Kara stumbled, dropping her flashlight as they advanced. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Desperate, she raised her camera and snapped another photo. The flash momentarily blinded her, and when her vision cleared, she was alone on the platform. The train, the passengers, the conductor, they were gone. The mist had lifted, revealing the familiar outline of the crumbling depot. Her hands were shaking as she retrieved her flashlight and camera. She didn't dare look at the photos she had taken, not yet. She ran back to her car, her heart pounding in her chest, and sped away from the depot without looking back. It wasn't until she was safely home that she reviewed the images. Most were as she expected, eerie shots of the dilapidated depot and its surroundings. But then she reached the photos of the train. The first image showed the train as it had appeared to her. Solid, real, and undeniably there. The second was stranger. The train was blurred, almost transparent, as though it didn't fully exist. The passengers' faces were clearer now, and she recognized them. They were the faces of people who had disappeared from the town over the years, faces she had seen in old missing persons reports during her research. At the center of the photo was the conductor, staring directly at the camera, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The third photo was the worst. The train was gone, replaced by an image of Kara herself. She was standing on the platform, her face pale and blank, her eyes unseeing. Behind her, the depot was no longer in ruins. It was restored, glowing with that same unnatural light. Kara stared at the image, her breath catching in her throat. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, jolting her out of her trance. She picked it up and saw an unknown number. "Hello?" she said, her voice trembling. A familiar voice answered. "Your ticket has been processed. The next train arrives at midnight." The line went dead. Kara dropped the phone and stared at the clock. It was 11:59. Outside, she heard the whistle of a train. The asylum had been a towering symbol of hope when it first opened its doors in the late 19th century, promising cutting-edge care for the mentally ill. Decades later, it was abandoned, a grim relic of the past shrouded in rumors of abuse and inhumane experiments. Most of the town's residents avoided it, considering it cursed ground. But to Derek, it was a goldmine of historical intrigue. Derek was a graduate student in history, writing his thesis on forgotten institutions of the Victorian era. He had spent months sifting through dusty archives and interviewing aging locals about the asylum. The common thread in their stories was the underground tunnels, passageways supposedly used for transporting patients, supplies, and, according to legend, hiding bodies. When Derek learned the asylum was slated for demolition, he knew he had to visit. He convinced his professor to let him document the site as part of his research. Armed with a flashlight, camera, and a notebook, he made his way to the asylum on a cold, overcast morning. The building loomed before him, its facade a crumbling mix of ivy-covered bricks and shattered windows. The wind whistled through the empty corridors, carrying with it an unsettling echo. Derek steeled himself and stepped inside. The interior was worse than he imagined. The walls were streaked with mold, and the floor was littered with broken furniture, discarded medical tools, and remnants of old patient files. He took several photos, documenting the eerie decay, before focusing on his primary goal: finding the tunnels. Derek's research had led him to believe the entrance was in the basement, near the old morgue. He found the basement stairs easily enough, descending into the shadows as the air grew colder. The flashlight beam wavered as he reached the bottom, revealing a heavy iron door hanging ajar. Above it, a faded sign read, "Restricted access." "This has to be it," Derek muttered, his breath visible in the frigid air. Pushing the door open, he found himself in a narrow, brick-lined corridor. The air was thick and stale, carrying a faint metallic tang. He switched on his camera, capturing the scene as he walked deeper into the tunnel. The walls were scrawled with strange markings. Some appeared to be patient records hastily written in chalk or charcoal. Names, dates, and cryptic phrases like, "They watch us" and "never sleep." Others were more disturbing. Smeared handprints and symbols Derek didn't recognize. His unease grew with every step. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness swallowing his flashlight's beam. The sound of his footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the space were far larger than it appeared. Then he heard it, a faint whisper. Derek froze, holding his breath. The sound was distant, barely audible, but unmistakable. It wasn't the wind or the creak of the old building. It was a voice, speaking words he couldn't quite make out. "Hello," he called, his voice trembling. The whisper stopped. He shook his head, chastising himself. "Just your imagination," he muttered, forcing himself to move forward. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, its walls lined with rusted gurneys and shelves filled with dusty jars. The jars contained murky liquid and unidentifiable specimens, their labels long faded. In the center of the room stood a table, its surface stained dark with something that might have been blood. Derek snapped a photo, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. As he reviewed the image on his camera's screen, his heart skipped a beat. There was something in the corner of the frame, a shadowy figure, just barely visible. He swung his flashlight toward the spot, but there was nothing there. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing from every direction. Derek spun around, his flashlight beam darting across the room. The whispers seemed to form words, but they were in a language he didn't understand. His pulse raced as he realized the voices were growing closer. Panicking, he turned back toward the tunnel, but the way he had come was gone. In its place was another corridor, identical to the first but completely unfamiliar. He swore under his breath, trying to calm the rising tide of fear. "Keep moving," he thought. "There has to be another way out." The new corridor was narrower, the air colder and heavier. Derek's flashlight began to flicker, plunging him into brief moments of darkness. He could hear footsteps now, soft, shuffling steps echoing behind him. He didn't dare look back. The whispers grew into a cacophony, overlapping voices that seemed to seep into his mind. He stumbled into another room, this one smaller and filled with strange equipment. Old surgical tools hung from the walls, their edges rusted but still sharp. A single chair sat in the center of the room, its leather straps frayed and stained. As Derek approached, he saw a figure sitting in the chair. It was a man, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken and lifeless. Derek stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight, but the figure didn't move. Then its head turned. "You're not supposed to be here," the man said, his voice a hollow rasp. Derek bolted, sprinting down the corridor without any sense of direction. The whispers followed him, accompanied by the sound of laughter, childlike giggles that echoed in the darkness. He tripped and fell, his flashlight skittering across the floor and plunging him into darkness. When he scrambled to retrieve it, he saw them. Figures lined the walls of the tunnel, their faces pale and eyeless, their mouths moving in silent whispers. They watched him, their heads tilting in unison as he backed away. The tunnel seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing closer as the figures advanced. Derek screamed, his voice drowned out by the whispers. He ran blindly, his flashlight flickering as he stumbled through the darkness. He didn't know how long he ran, minutes, hours, days. Time had lost all meaning. Finally, he saw a light ahead. He sprinted toward it, bursting out into the open air. He collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath. The asylum loomed behind him, silent and still, as if nothing had happened. He didn't stop running until he was back in his car. Only when he was miles away did he dare to look at his camera. Most of the photos were normal images of the asylum's decay. But then he reached the last one. It was a picture of the tunnel, filled with shadowy figures. At the center was Derek himself, staring into the camera with empty eyes. The whispers never stopped. Even now, as he sits in his apartment, he hears them. They call to him, pulling him back to the asylum. He knows he won't be able to resist for long. The lighthouse stood on a rocky cliff, battered by the relentless waves of the northern sea. For over a century, it had warned ships of the treacherous waters below, its beacon cutting through the thick fog like a blade. But 20 years ago, after a devastating storm claimed both the lighthouse keeper and his young daughter, the structure had been abandoned. Now it was little more than a crumbling relic, a ghost of its former self. To Andrea, it was the perfect place to write. She had been struggling with writer's block for months, her once prolific career as a novelist grinding to a halt. When she stumbled across an ad for the lighthouse on a rental website, its isolated location and dramatic setting seemed ideal. She booked it for a month, packed her car, and drove out to the remote coast. The lighthouse was exactly as she imagined, weathered and hauntingly beautiful. The attached keeper's quarters were small but cozy, with a wood-burning stove and a desk that faced the sea. Andrea unpacked her belongings and settled in, determined to write her way out of her creative slump. The first few days passed uneventfully. Andrea spent her mornings exploring the cliffs and her afternoons staring at her laptop, willing the words to come. The only sound was the constant crash of waves against the rocks below. But on the fourth night, everything changed. Andrea was sitting at her desk, watching the moonlight glint off the ocean, when she noticed the faint glow of the lighthouse beacon. She frowned, her gaze snapping toward the tower. She hadn't touched the controls, and the lighthouse had been decommissioned for decades. The light shouldn't have been working. Curiosity got the better of her. She grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the tower, her boots echoing against the metal steps. The air grew colder as she climbed, and she shivered, pulling her sweater tighter around her shoulders. When she reached the top, the beacon was spinning, its light sweeping across the sea. The machinery groaned as it turned, but there was no sign of anyone inside. Andrea hesitated. "Hello?" she called, her voice swallowed by the howling wind. There was no response. Uneasy, she switched off the beacon and descended the stairs. As she reached the bottom, she thought she heard a faint sound, a child's laughter, carried on the wind. She froze, her flashlight beam darting across the room. But she was alone. Shaking off the feeling, she returned to the keeper's quarters. She told herself it was just her imagination, the isolation playing tricks on her. But that night, she dreamt of the lighthouse. In her dream, the beacon shone endlessly, casting its light over a dark, stormy sea. A small figure stood at the top of the tower, silhouetted against the spinning light. When she woke, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her. The days blurred into nights, and strange things began to happen. She would hear footsteps on the stairs, but when she investigated, the tower was empty. Objects in the keeper's quarters moved when she wasn't looking. A book left open to a page she hadn't read, a cup of tea poured when she hadn't boiled the kettle, and always the beacon. No matter how many times she turned it off, it would come to life again, spinning in silent defiance. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Andrea heard the laughter again. This time it was unmistakable, a high-pitched giggle coming from outside. Heart pounding, she grabbed her flashlight and stepped onto the rocky path that led to the cliff's edge. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks filled the air, but the laughter persisted, growing louder. Andrea followed it, her flashlight beam cutting through the gathering fog. She stopped when she reached the edge of the cliff. There, standing on the rocks below, was a little girl. Her white dress billowed in the wind, and her long dark hair clung to her face. She looked up at Andrea and smiled, her eyes glinting in the moonlight. "Who are you?" Andrea called, her voice trembling. The girl didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward the lighthouse. Andrea turned, her stomach nodding. The beacon was spinning again, its light cutting through the fog. When she looked back, the girl was gone. Shaken, Andrea returned to the keeper's quarters. She tried to write, hoping to distract herself, but her hands trembled too much to type. Finally, she gave up and crawled into bed, her mind racing with questions. That night, her dream returned. She was at the top of the tower, the beacon's light blinding her. The little girl stood beside her, her expression solemn. "You have to help me?" the girl said, her voice echoing in Andrea's mind. "Help you with what?" Andrea asked, but the girl didn't answer. She turned and pointed toward the sea. Andrea followed her gaze and saw a shipwreck below, its broken hull jutting out of the waves. She woke with a start, her heart pounding. The first rays of dawn were creeping through the window, but the dream lingered in her mind. Determined to make sense of it, she grabbed her flashlight and headed down to the rocks. The tide was low, revealing a section of the shore she hadn't seen before. Among the jagged rocks and seaweed, she spotted the remains of an old shipwreck. Her stomach tightened as she approached, the dream replaying in her mind. It was an old fishing vessel, its wood rotting and splintered. As she examined the wreckage, she spotted something lodged between the planks. A locket, tarnished and weathered by the sea. She pried it loose and opened it, revealing a photograph inside. It was the little girl. Andrea's breath caught in her throat. She stuffed the locket into her pocket and stumbled back to the lighthouse. The girl's laughter echoed in her ears, growing louder and louder until it became a scream. When she reached the keeper's quarters, the door slammed shut behind her. The air grew heavy, and the room filled with the scent of salt and decay. She turned to find the little girl standing in the corner, her eyes hollow and black. "You have to finish it," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of Andrea's heart. "Finish what?" Andrea asked, her voice shaking. The girl didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed toward the lighthouse. The beacon flared to life, brighter than ever, and Andrea understood. The lighthouse wasn't just a warning. It was a beacon for the dead, guiding lost souls back to the shore. The girl's spirit had been trapped here, waiting for someone to light the way. Andrea climbed the tower, her steps heavy with dread. As she reached the top, the air grew cold, and she felt the weight of countless eyes watching her. She turned the controls, adjusting the beacon until it cast its light over the shipwreck below. The girl appeared beside her, her hollow eyes filling with tears. "Thank you," she whispered before vanishing into the light. The next morning, the lighthouse was silent. The beacon no longer shone, and the oppressive presence that had haunted Andrea was gone. She packed her belongings and left, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the girl's story would never be told. But as she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the beacon flash one last time. The carnival had once been the pride of the region, drawing crowds from towns and cities alike. Its Ferris wheel rose high above the treetops, its colorful tents promising wonders and delights. But over the years, rumors began to swirl. Disappearances, strange accidents, and eerie sounds that carried on the wind at night. By the time it closed, the carnival had become infamous. Left to rot deep in the woods, it was said to be haunted by the souls of those who had vanished there. Sam didn't believe in ghost stories. He was a thrill seeker, always on the hunt for his next adrenaline rush. When he heard about the abandoned carnival, he knew he had to check it out. His friends refused to join him, citing the carnival's sinister reputation, but that only made the prospect more enticing. He arrived just before dusk, parking his car at the edge of the woods. The overgrown path leading to the carnival was barely visible, but Sam followed it with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the gathering shadows. The forest grew darker as he walked, the branches overhead forming a canopy that blocked out the fading light. When he finally emerged from the trees, the carnival stood before him, shrouded in mist. The Ferris wheel was a rusted skeleton, its cabins swaying gently in the breeze. The tents had collapsed, their vibrant colors faded to dull grays. Rides that had once thrilled visitors were now frozen in eerie stillness, their mechanisms long since decayed. Sam grinned. Perfect. He pulled out his phone and started recording, narrating his exploration for the handful of followers on his adventure vlog. All right, folks, here it is, the legendary Forgotten Carnival. Let's see if it lives up to the hype. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and mildew as Sam wandered through the carnival grounds. He passed a carousel, its once bright horses now chipped and faded, their glass eyes staring blankly ahead. The eerie silence was broken only by the occasional creak of wood or the rustle of leaves. As he explored, he began to notice strange details. A clown's face painted on a sign seemed to be smiling wider than it had when he first saw it. A doll left in the wreckage of a game booth looked as though it had moved, its head tilted to watch him. Sam dismissed it as his imagination, refusing to let fear creep in. He stopped in front of the Ferris wheel, craning his neck to look up at its towering frame. The cabins swayed rhythmically, though there was no wind. The sight sent a shiver down his spine, but he forced a laugh. Creepy, right? I bet this thing hasn't moved in years. As if in response, the Ferris wheel groaned. The cabins began to spin slowly, the rusted machinery screeching in protest. Sam froze, his phone still recording. What the hell? The Ferris wheel picked up speed, its motion impossibly smooth for something so old and broken. The lights lining its frame flickered to life, casting an eerie glow over the carnival. Music drifted through the air, a distorted tune that sent chills down Sam's spine. He turned in a circle, his flashlight beam darting across the carnival grounds. The rides were coming to life. The carousel spun, its horses bobbing up and down as the haunting music swelled. A funhouse door creaked open, its entrance illuminated by flickering lights. The laughter of children echoed faintly, though the grounds were empty. Sam's pulse quickened. He told himself it was a prank, maybe some elaborate setup by other urban explorers. Nice try, guys, he shouted, his voice trembling. You almost got me. No one answered. He backed away from the Ferris wheel, but as he did, he saw movement in the shadows. Figures began to emerge. Clowns, acrobats, and carnival workers, their faces pale and lifeless. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light as they moved toward him, their footsteps unnaturally silent. Sam's breath caught in his throat. Okay, this isn't funny anymore. He turned to run, but the path he had taken through the woods was gone, replaced by more carnival tents and rides. The figures followed, their faces blank but their movements purposeful. Sam ducked into a nearby tent, his flashlight flickering as he tried to catch his breath. The tent was filled with mirrors, their surfaces warped and cracked. Sam's reflection stared back at him, distorted and elongated. He moved to the center of the room, spinning in place as the whispers began. Stay, play. The voices were faint but unmistakable, filling the air like a chorus. Sam's reflection didn't match his movements now. It grinned at him, its eyes glowing faintly. He stumbled backward, tripping over something on the floor. When he looked down, he saw a child's stuffed animal. A rabbit, its fur matted and one ear torn. It looked fresh, as though it had been dropped only moments ago. Before he could process this, his reflection stepped out of the mirror. Sam screamed, scrambling to his feet as the distorted version of himself advanced. It moved jerkily, its grin widening impossibly as it reached for him. He bolted from the tent, the laughter of children echoing behind him. The carnival was alive now, its lights blazing and music blaring. The figures from before were everywhere, running the rides and manning the booths. Children darted between them, their faces pale and empty, their laughter high and shrill. Come on, a voice whispered in his ear. Win a prize. Sam spun around, finding himself in front of a game booth. A grinning clown gestured to a row of bottles. Just knock them down, it said, its voice like grinding glass. Sam shook his head, backing away. No, no, I'm not playing. You already are, the clown said, its grin widening. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The carnival wasn't a place, it was a trap. Those who entered became part of the game, their souls claimed by the twisted figures that ran it. He had been lured here just like the others. Desperate, he sprinted toward the Ferris wheel, the only structure that seemed untouched by the chaos. As he climbed into one of the cabins, the figures swarmed below, their hands reaching for him. The Ferris wheel began to spin, carrying him higher and higher until he could see the entire carnival. From above, the truth became clear. The carnival grounds formed a giant sigil, its rides and tents arranged in a pattern of dark magic. The lights pulsed rhythmically, feeding the power of the trap. Sam felt the air grow heavier, his vision blurring as the Ferris wheel reached its peak. The cabin stopped, leaving him suspended above the glowing carnival. The distorted music faded, replaced by the sound of whispers. Stay, play. Sam's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, the screen flashing a single message. Game over. The Ferris wheel began to descend, the figures waiting below with outstretched arms. Sam screamed, but the carnival drowned him out. The next morning, the carnival was silent once more. Deep in the woods, a new stuffed rabbit sat on the ground, waiting for the next visitor. The town of Black Hollow had been abandoned for nearly a century. Once a bustling mining settlement, it fell into ruin after the mine collapsed, claiming dozens of lives. Those who survived left soon after, leaving behind their homes, businesses, and a graveyard that now served as the only record of the town's brief existence. Over the years, the town gained a reputation for being cursed. Locals spoke of shadowy figures in the windows of the crumbling buildings and whispers that carried on the wind. None of this deterred Jake and Travis. The two amateur treasure hunters had been scouring old maps and mining records for months, convinced Black Hollow was hiding untold riches. Rumors of a lost gold stash, hidden by desperate miners during the collapse, had drawn them to the ghost town despite its dark history. The pair arrived just before sunset, their truck kicking up dust as it rolled into the desolate streets. The town was eerily silent, its wooden buildings leaning precariously, their weathered facades barely holding together. Nature had reclaimed much of the area, with vines creeping up the walls and grass sprouting through cracks in the road. This place is a dump, Travis said, hopping out of the truck and slinging his metal detector over his shoulder. Yeah, but it could make us rich, Jake replied, grinning. He gestured toward the hill overlooking the town. The graveyard's up there. That's where we'll find it. Travis frowned. You really think they'd bury gold in a graveyard? Seems disrespectful. Jake shrugged. You heard the stories. The miners hid it somewhere they thought no one would look. Where better than a graveyard? Travis didn't argue. He wasn't thrilled about disturbing graves, but the thought of unearthing lost gold outweighed his unease. The two men grabbed their gear and set off toward the hill, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the ruins. As they climbed, the graveyard came into view. A wrought iron fence surrounded a small cluster of headstones, their surfaces worn smooth by time. The gate hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Beyond it, the graves were overgrown with weeds, the names and dates barely legible. Jake pulled out his metal detector and switched it on, the device emitting a series of beeps as he swept it over the ground. All right, he said, grinning. Let's find some gold. Travis hesitated at the gate. The air felt heavier here, colder, as though the graveyard existed in its own pocket of time. He shook off the feeling and joined Jake, his own detector humming as he began to search. For a while, they found nothing but rusty nails and old coins. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the graveyard was bathed in the dim glow of twilight. The shadows grew darker, longer, and the silence pressed down on them like a physical weight. Then Jake's detector let out a sharp, rapid beep. Got something, he said, kneeling to dig. Travis watched uneasily as Jake unearthed a small metal box, its surface tarnished and corroded. Inside was a bundle of papers, receipts by the look of it, and a few gold coins. Jake's face lit up. "See? Told you this place was worth it." Travis didn't share his excitement. He felt a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, as though they were being watched. "Maybe we should call it a night," he said. "Come back tomorrow." Jake scoffed. "Are you kidding? We just found gold. There's probably more down there." Ignoring Travis's protests, Jake moved to another grave and began digging. Travis sighed and followed, though every instinct screamed at him to leave. As they worked, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint whisper. At first, Travis thought it was his imagination, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. He froze, his shovel hovering over the dirt. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Jake didn't look up. "Hear what?" "The whispering." Jake snorted. "You're just spooked. Focus." But Travis couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The whispers grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching them. That was when the ground began to shift. Jake yelped as the dirt beneath him caved in, swallowing his legs up to the knees. "Help me!" he shouted, clawing at the ground. Travis rushed to his side, grabbing his arm and pulling with all his strength. The dirt seemed to grip Jake like quicksand, dragging him deeper as he thrashed. Finally, with one last tug, Travis freed him, and they both fell back, panting. The grave they had been digging in was now a gaping hole, the earth dark and damp. Inside, Travis thought he saw movement, a skeletal hand reaching up from the shadows. "We need to go," Travis said, his voice trembling. "Now." But Jake shook his head, his greed overriding his fear. "Not until we find more gold." The whispers turned into a low, guttural moan, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. All around them, the graves shifted, the earth splitting open as skeletal figures clawed their way to the surface. Their hollow eyes burned with an unnatural light, and their mouths moved in silent curses. Jake stumbled back, his bravado finally crumbling. "What the hell is this?" "The curse," Travis said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We disturbed their graves." The skeletal figures advanced, their bony fingers reaching for the two men. Jake and Travis ran, tripping over headstones and fallen branches as the dead pursued them. The whispers turned into wails, a cacophony of anguish that filled the night. When they reached the gate, Travis slammed it shut behind them, the metal clanging loudly. But the dead didn't stop. They pressed against the fence, their skeletal hands gripping the bars as they stared at the men with empty eyes. Jake's hands were shaking as he pulled the gold coins from his pocket. "Take it back," he shouted, throwing the coins toward the gate. "We don't want it." The coins landed in the dirt, but the dead didn't retreat. Their wails grew louder, more piercing, and the ground beneath Jake and Travis began to quake. "We need to get out of here," Travis said, grabbing Jake's arm. The two men ran down the hill, the town's ruins barely visible in the darkness. They didn't stop until they reached their truck, jumping in and peeling out onto the dirt road. As they drove away, the whispers faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Neither man spoke, their faces pale and their hands trembling. It wasn't until they were miles from Black Hollow that Jake finally broke the silence. "Do you think they'll follow us?" Travis didn't answer. He was too busy staring at the rearview mirror, where the glowing eyes of the dead still lingered in the distance. The next morning, the townspeople found Jake's truck parked on the side of the road, its doors wide open. The seats were empty, save for 2 piles of dirt and a single gold coin.